Hi, my name is David Kelsey. Today we're going to be talking about categorical logic. Okay. So categorical logic is a kind of system of formal logic. And I think the best way to think about something like this is in virtue of mathematics. Right? So in mathematics, it's kind of like a language where you manipulate different symbols. Right, and in mathematics, the symbols are like numbers, and you have addition and subtraction and these kinds of equations and things. The way that formal logic works is very similar, except instead of numbers, we use words and sentences and things like this. And so, I think that there's an analogy there. Now, in particular, with the logic we're going to work on. The sort of basic unit or basic idea that's at the bottom of all of this, right? With mathematics, your basic unit is the number, right? And so you manipulate numbers. In categorical logic, you manipulate categories. Okay, so the basic unit is not number, but what we call a category. So a category is kind of like a set or a group of things that are all sharing some feature, like for example, logic students, right? That's a category that shares the property of being, a student of logic, right? Okay, so the next point to make about this logic is that when we deal with this logic, we are dealing with these categories like logic students, we just mentioned. But the way that our logic works is it kind of works, again, if you think back to mathematics, right? In mathematics you have kind of like equations, For example, addition is an operation, you might have 2 added to 2 is 4, So in our logic, what we do is we kind of have categories that are related to each other in virtue of the relationship of exclusion or inclusion. Right? And so a sentence will come in that relates to categories as far as excluding or including one to the other, right? So for example, you might say something like, all logic students are smart, right? And here what this claim does is it sort of includes the logic students within the smart ones, right? Or you might say that, even simpler, all tigers are mammals, right? A claim like that, what it does is it includes the tigers in the group of, in the category of mammals, right? That's the idea. On the other side, you can see a claim like, for example, if I said no sharks are land mammals, right? That would be a relationship of exclusion. Essentially what that kind of claim says is that the class of sharks is excluded from the class of land mammals. So they don't share any members, right? And so there's a relationship of exclusion there. Okay, so what our logic will do essentially, our sentences, the sentences that we manipulate in our logic will essentially do that. They will exclude or include one class in or from another, right? Okay, so then that brings us to the notion of a categorical claim. A categorical claim is a claim that either that relates to categories, to classes, right? So, for example, again, I might say that no sharks are land mammals, or I might say that all tigers are mammals. Those are categorical claims, and a categorical claim is about 2 different categories, and it relates those 2 categories either again by exclusion or inclusion. And so that's what a categorical claim does. A categorical claim is any claim that relates to categories like that. And so some examples, coffee shops are great places to hang out, right? Essentially what that does is relates the category of coffee shop to the category of great places to hang out. Another example, college students are never late to class, right? And so this claim is relating the category of college students with the category of something like people that are never late to class, right? The next example we have here is some phones get good reception, right? And again, this claim is relating the class of phones with the class of things that get good reception, right? And so a categorical claim, that's all it does, is it relates two categories like that, okay? And really, when you think about our logic, the categorical claim is at the heart of it, right? And so our logic, the sentences that we have and that we work with and that our logic manipulates here are categorical claims, and only categorical claims. The specific type of categorical claim that our logic manipulates and deals with, right, is what we call a standard form categorical claim. So as I said before, our logic only deals with and only manipulates categorical claims. Well, even more specifically, our logic can only handle, it can only manipulate, it can only deal with what's called a standard form categorical claim. And this is a very specific type of categorical claim. So here now, we're going to have a discussion of what's called a standard form categorical claim. That's the next topic of our discussion here. And a standard form categorical claim is first and foremost a categorical claim. And if you remember back, a categorical claim is just a claim that relates two different categories, right? Now, a standard form categorical claim is a claim that does that in a very specific way. And there are four types of standard form categorical claims, right? So the first one has a form which says all blanks are blank. For example, I could say all tigers are mammals, right? That is a standard form categorical claim. Now we call that type of claim that has that specific form an A claim. An A claim begins with the word all, right? That's kind of like the quantifier word in the beginning of the claim. And then it has a placeholder, and then it has what we call the copula, or the word are here, which is a kind of present tense plural of the verb to be, and then it has another placeholder, right? The next type of claim we call the E claim, right? And the E claim has the form no blanks are blank. So for example, no sharks are plants, right? That's what we call an E claim. And then an I claim comes in the form of some blanks are blanks. So for example, some soccer players are basketball players. That would be an I claim. And then lastly, the fourth type of claim, standard form categorical claim we have, is what we call an O claim. And an O claim looks like some blanks are not blank, right? So some surfers, for example, are not great students, right? That would be an O claim. Now these are the four types of claims that we have to work with. These are the only four types of claims that our logic can manipulate and handle. Now you can see with each of these four types of claims, they have a certain look to them. So the first thing you'll notice is that each of the four claims has two blanks in it, or two what we maybe call placeholders, right? And I think the way you want to think about those is as what we call a term. So a term goes in those blanks. So you know that with every standard form categorical claim, it has two terms, right? There's a blank, a term that goes first, and then there's a term that goes second in the claim. So for example, if we look at the A claim, all tigers are mammals, your terms there are tigers and mammals, right? Tigers and mammals. And we say that the first term that occurs in the blank there is what we call the subject term. And then the second term that occurs in the blank there is what we call the predicate term. Okay? And so the subject term, the subject term is just like it sounds, the subject of the claim. And then the predicate term is like it sounds, the predicate of the claim. So we can say that every standard form categorical claim will have a subject term and a predicate term. And the first thing we'll say is that the subject term represents, it's a term that represents the subject of the claim. Okay? And so the subject of the claim is kind of like it sounds, it's the subject or the topic of the claim, right? What the claim is about, right? And then the predicate term, right, which is what goes in the second placeholder, the second blank, is what we call the predicate of the claim. And the predicate of the claim is just it's a description of the subject term, right? it's predicated of the subject term, it's about the subject term. So for example, again, if we look at all tigers are mammals, mammals here is a description of the subject tigers, right? Specifically, that claim says that mammals, tigers, all tigers are mammals. So mammals there is about the subject tigers there. It's a description of them. It refers to those tigers there. And so that's essentially what happens with the predicate term, right? It's a description of the subject. Now, the terms themselves, right, there are two terms in every standard form categorical claim, and the terms themselves must be either nouns or noun phrases, okay? So a noun is a person, place, or thing. For example, the noun truck, right? Or the noun television or camera or clicker or light, right? Those are all nouns. And then the other option you can have for a term is what we call a noun phrase. So a noun phrase is just a noun, which is a person, place, or thing, sort of joined up with a description of it, right? So I could have, for example, the noun truck modified by the description red. And so we have the noun phrase red truck, right? Or I could have the noun phrase red truck from Alabama, right? And so I have a description of truck. So that's a noun phrase. Okay, so terms need to be either nouns or noun phrases. They can't, now one of the things, the kind of rules about terms is that they cannot be adjectives. Terms cannot be adjectives. So you cannot, for example, have as a term red alone, right? Just the adjective red. So any kind of adjective needs to be attached to a noun to be a proper term, right? And so what we do if we have an adjective is we just kind of modify it. We make it into a noun phrase by adding a noun that the adjective describes. Okay. Continuing on then with the claims, I just want to for a minute just go through some examples of the A, the E, the I, and the O claims. Right. Now, we can, for example, as we said, have an A claim like all tigers are mammals, but A claims can get much more complicated than that, right? So we might have, for example, all orange tigers are carnivorous mammals, right? That would be an A claim as well. And the subject term there would be orange tigers, and the predicate would be carnivorous mammals, right? We could have something like all televisions are electronic equipment, something like that, right? And so you can see that really the claims, these standard form categorical claims, are just sort of like, they're like sort of like open-ended sentences of a sort. You can kind of plug the terms in that you want and make whatever claim you like, So as an example of the E claim, we had no sharks or plants. We might have no sharks from the Atlantic Ocean are plants that are green and orange, something like this. So again, just sort of putting whatever terms we want in to make the claim that we'd like. An example that we had for the I claim is some soccer players are basketball players, right? Again, we might sort of play around with that one a bit, and you might have something like some soccer players that are left-footed are basketball players that are right-handed. I don't know. So, again, you can just sort of cook up the claim that you want, right? And at this point, too, we don't want to worry about whether these claims are true and false, so you can kind of have fun with them and make the claims that you want. For our last example, the O claim, again, our example, we had some surfers are not great students, right? So you might have instead something like some surfers from the Midwest that like to surf the local break here in Orange County, California, are not great students from Sacramento, California, right? So, I just sort of plugging in, kind of ridiculous sounding terms. But the point is that the O claim has this general form, some blanks are not blank, and we can, again, put terms in like we'd like. So, Okay, so then sort of moving on again, so far we've talked about how the terms have to be nouns or noun phrases. We've talked about each claim having two terms, the first being the subject term and the second the predicate term, right? And how the predicate term is a description of the subject term. Now the last point to make here is about the four types of claims that we can have and the nature of those types, right? So first, the claims can be affirmative or positive, right? And so the affirmative claims are the A and the I claims. And what affirmative claims do is they describe a relationship of inclusion. Okay, and so what we mean is that the two categories in an affirmative claim, one is described as being included in the other. Okay, so again, if you think back to the claim all tigers are mammals, that claim describes a relationship of sort of the tigers term being included in the mammals one, right? Because all of the tigers are mammals. And so with A and I claims, there's a relationship of inclusion there, right? With the I claims, you can see the inclusion being, sort of a different type, right? So if I say some people are surfers, right? That means that, or maybe better, some right-handed people are surfers. Maybe that's a better one. You can see how the class of right-handed people, some of those are included. The way that claim speaks is that some of those right-handed people are in the class of surfers, right? And so they share members, if that makes sense. Okay, and then for the E and the O claims, we call those negative claims because they describe a relationship of exclusion, one class being excluded from another, right? So again, if I said no sharks or plants, right, what I'm essentially saying is that there aren't any sharks that are included in the class of plants. They're excluded, right? All the members are excluded one from the other, right? One class from the other class, and so they don't share any members. So the members of one are excluded from the members of the other. And so you have this relationship of exclusion, and so we call that a kind of negative type of claim. So the E and O claims are described as negative, and the A and the I as affirmative, okay? And so I think that's the last thing we'll say about our logic for today. We have an introduction to just the kind of claims we're really going to be dealing with in our logic. And you have, again, these four types of claims. These standard form categorical claims. You have the A, the E, the I, and the O claim. And they all really have a very similar form to them, but we want to stick to that format when we use our logic and the language of our logic, okay? So hope that helps, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.